Sophie's muffled scream echoed through the empty hallway of the house, but no one else was there to hear it, except her stepmother. The 7-year-old girl, her large brown eyes now brimming with tears, pressed herself against the bedroom wall as Rachel glared at her with a coldness that starkly contrasted with the sweet smile she displayed whenever David was around. "If you tell your dad anything, it will be much worse," Rachel whispered, adjusting her perfectly styled hair as if nothing had happened. "He wouldn't believe you anyway?" David had no idea what was happening in his own home while he was at work. To him, his marriage to Rachel, celebrated just 6 months earlier, had been the perfect decision. After 3 years of raising Sophie alone following the tragic death of his first wife in a car accident, he thought he had finally found someone to complete his family. The first signs were so subtle that they went unnoticed. A purple mark on Sophie's arm, which she claimed happened while playing on the playground. The silent sobs that sometimes echoed down the hallway at night, dismissed by Rachel as mere childhood nightmares. The increasingly dark and somber drawings Sophie created at school, filled with gloomy tones where bright colors used to dominate. It was Ashley, Sophie's teacher, who first noticed that something was wrong. One crisp autumn afternoon, as dry leaves swirled across the schoolyard, she asked David to meet with her after class. "David, we need to talk about Sophie," Ashley began, her face etched with genuine concern. "I've noticed significant changes in her behavior over the past few weeks. She's more withdrawn, rarely participates in group activities, and her drawings—" Ashley paused, choosing her words carefully. "Well, they've become different." David felt a tightening in his chest as Ashley showed him Sophie's recent artwork. Where there were once colorful houses and smiling families, there were now only dark figures and sorrowful faces. In one drawing, a small figure stood alone in a corner while a looming shadow hovered over her. "I've tried talking to her," Ashley continued, "but she completely shuts down. David, in my experience as a teacher, these kinds of changes often signal that something is deeply troubling the child. Something that's weighing heavily on her." David let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of anxiety. "She's been quieter at home too," he admitted. "But I thought it was just part of adjusting. You know, with the new marriage." "Maybe," Ashley replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. "But I think it's important for you to pay extra attention to her over the next few days. Sometimes, children don't know how to ask for help directly." That evening, during dinner, David observed his family with fresh eyes. Rachel served the meal with her usual efficiency, smiling and asking everyone about their day. Sophie, seated in her chair with her feet swinging above the floor, barely touched her food. Her gaze was fixed on her plate, and she flinched slightly whenever Rachel came near. "Sophie, sweetheart, you need to eat," Rachel said with a sweetness that, after David's conversation with Ashley, now felt oddly artificial. "Don't you want to grow strong like your dad?" The girl simply shook her head, her small fingers gripping the fork with unnecessary force. "Maybe she's not feeling well," David suggested, reaching out to touch his daughter's forehead. The moment he moved, Sophie flinched instinctively, a quick, subtle reaction he almost missed. Almost. That small gesture triggered something in David. A nagging unease began to churn in his gut, a suspicion he wasn't ready to admit, even to himself. He watched Rachel and Sophie's interactions more closely, noticing for the first time the veiled fear in his daughter's eyes whenever her stepmother drew near. Later that night, after tucking Sophie into bed, David remained in his office, mentally retracing the past few months. The changes in his daughter's behavior had started gradually, but now that he thought about it, they coincided perfectly with Rachel's arrival in their lives. He recalled Rachel's seemingly innocent comments about how Sophie could be difficult at times, how the girl needed to learn discipline. Back then he had agreed, thinking it was simply the eagerness of a new mother trying to set boundaries. Now those words took on a much darker meaning. As David sorted through some papers, he came across an old drawing Sophie had made just months before his marriage to Rachel. In it, father and daughter held hands, their faces lit up with wide smiles, a bright sun shining in the corner of the page. The stark contrast between that picture and the ones Ashley had shown him was heartbreaking. A sudden noise in the hallway caught his attention. Stepping silently out of his office, David heard voices coming from Sophie's room. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack he saw something that would change his life forever. Rachel was leaning over Sophie's bed, her fingers digging into the girl's arm as she whispered threats that froze the blood in David's veins. "If you keep crying at night and waking your dad, I'll have to take more serious measures. Do you want me to send you to a boarding school far, far away?" Sophie sobbed quietly, her small body trembling as she nodded in compliance. It was in that moment that David felt his world crumble. The woman he had brought into his home, the one he had entrusted with his daughter's care, was showing her true colors, a cruelty he could never have imagined. His first instinct was to storm into the room and confront Rachel on the spot, but something held him back. If he acted impulsively now, without solid proof, Rachel could deny everything, and things might become even worse for Sophie. No, he needed to be smarter. He needed to protect his daughter, but he also had to ensure that Rachel could never harm another child again. With a heavy heart and a whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind, David quietly returned to his office. As he sat down in his chair, a single tear slid down his face, carrying the weight of guilt for not realizing the truth sooner, and the unshakable resolve to do whatever it took to protect his daughter. The true face of love was about to emerge, not in the false affection of a manipulative stepmother, but in the unwavering strength of a father determined to fight for his child, no matter the cost. The sun had barely risen when David was already seated in his office, his red eyes betraying a sleepless night. In front of him, a cup of coffee sat untouched and cold as he mentally pieced together a plan. Rachel's venomous words echoed in his mind, accompanied by the haunting memory of Sophie's muffled sobs. That morning he observed his daughter even more closely during breakfast. Sophie listlessly stirred her cereal, her eyes darting nervously toward Rachel, who moved around the kitchen with her usual calculated efficiency. It felt like watching a sinister play unfold, Rachel flawlessly performing the role of the loving stepmother, while Sophie lived in a state of constant, veiled fear. "I'll take Sophie to school today," David announced abruptly, catching Rachel off guard. Usually she handled that routine. "But sweetheart, you'll be late for work," Rachel protested, her smile faltering for the briefest moment. "You know I don't mind taking her. I want to spend more time with her," David replied, keeping his tone casual as he grabbed the car keys. "I've realized I've been too absent lately." On the drive to school, David attempted to talk to Sophie, but she remained silent, staring out the window. He could see her reflection in the glass, her large, frightened eyes so different from the joyful child she used to be. "Sophie, sweetheart," he began, carefully choosing his words. "You know you can tell me anything, right? Anything at all." Sophie stayed quiet, but David noticed how her small fingers tightened their grip on her backpack strap. "Daddy will always protect you," he continued, his voice gentle but resolute. "No matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, I will always believe you." When they arrived at school, before Sophie got out of the car, David hugged her tighter than usual. He felt how she initially flinched at his touch, a conditioned reflex that broke his heart, before she relaxed in his arms. At school, David sought out Ashley again. The teacher welcomed him into her classroom during the break, her eyes reflecting concern as she noticed his serious expression. "Ashley, I need your help," David said, closing the door behind him. "I think you were right about Sophie. Something is seriously wrong at home." Ashley listened intently as David shared his suspicions, including the scene he had witnessed the previous night. Her face grew pale as he described Rachel's behavior. "I've seen cases like this before," Ashley said, her professional tone barely masking the anger she felt. "We need to document everything. Every mark, every change in behavior, every drawing. And most importantly, we need to make Sophie feel safe enough to talk." "How can I prove what's happening?" David asked, frustration evident in his voice. "Rachel is very careful. She never leaves visible marks and always has a plausible explanation for everything. There are signs that can't be hidden," Ashley replied, pulling a folder from her file cabinet. "Sophie's drawings are one example. Look at how the dark figure always appears in the same places, always threatening. Children her age express their fears through art when they can't verbalize them." David spent the rest of the day at work, but his mind was elsewhere. He discreetly installed an app on his phone that allowed him to record audio remotely. Before leaving the office, he made an important phone call. Dr. Catherine Bennett's office, answered a professional voice. "I need to schedule an urgent appointment," David said. "It's about my daughter. She needs help." Dr. Bennett was a renowned child psychologist, specializing in trauma and abuse cases. David had researched her late into the night, reading numerous articles and testimonials from families she had helped. At home, David began making subtle changes to his routine. He started coming home earlier, often unannounced, observing the interactions between Rachel and Sophie when they didn't expect him. He also took a more active role in Sophie's nightly routine, ensuring he was the one putting her to bed. Rachel noticed the changes and her mask of perfection began to crack. Her smiles grew more strained, her comments more cautious. During dinner, David caught her throwing warning glances at Sophie whenever she thought he wasn't looking. One night, while Rachel was in the shower, David quietly entered Sophie's room. She was sitting on her bed, clutching a worn-out teddy bear. "Sophie," he called softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Do you remember when Mommy went to heaven?" Sophie nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Back then, I promised we would always be honest with each other, remember? That no matter how sad or scary something was, we could always talk about it." Sophie hugged the teddy bear tighter, and David saw a tear roll down her cheek. "Is something happening that's making you sad or scared?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a barely audible whisper, Sophie said, "Rachel said you wouldn't believe me." David's heart shattered at her words, but he held himself together. "Sophie, look at me," he said gently. When she lifted her eyes to meet his, he continued, "I will always believe you. And I will do anything to protect you." At that moment they heard the shower turning off. Sophie immediately recoiled, and David saw the fear return to her eyes. "Trust me," he whispered, kissing her forehead before leaving the room. "Things will get better, I promise." Back in his office, David picked up his phone and checked the day's recording. His hand trembled as he pressed play, and tears finally streamed down his face as Rachel's voice, recorded earlier that day while he was still at work, filled the room. "You're a bad girl, Sophie. Do you know what happens to bad girls? They get sent away from their parents. Is that what you want? Then stop crying and do as I say." David stopped the recording, unable to listen any longer. His hands clenched into fists, and he had to take several deep breaths to control the rage threatening to consume him. The proof he needed was there, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to ensure that Rachel could never hurt Sophie or any other child again. The appointment with Dr. Bennett was scheduled for the next day, and David knew it would be just the beginning of a difficult battle. But as he looked at the photo of Sophie on his desk, a portrait from happier times, he knew he would do whatever it took to protect his daughter. The silent war in his home was about to turn into an open battle, and David was determined to win no matter the cost. Dr. Catherine Bennett's office radiated an atmosphere carefully designed to make children feel safe. The pastel-colored walls were adorned with vibrant drawings from former patients, and shelves filled with therapeutic toys lined the corners of the room. Sophie sat on a soft rug, her small fingers clutching a crayon tightly as she drew, seemingly oblivious to the watchful eyes of the psychologist. Outside, David paced back and forth in the waiting room, his heart pounding so loudly it felt as though everyone could hear it. With each passing minute, his anxiety grew. The ticking of the clock on the wall echoed in his mind, each second a torturous reminder as he imagined his little girl finally finding the courage to reveal her deepest fears. When the door finally opened after what seemed like an eternity, Sophie emerged with red, swollen eyes, clutching a small stuffed bear that Dr. Bennett had lent her during the session. David's heart shattered at the sight of the tear-streaked face of his daughter. "Sophie, darling," Dr. Bennett's gentle voice filled the silence, "Sarah has some wonderful books in the reception area. How about you pick one to take home while I have a quick word with your father?" The little girl nodded silently, throwing a quick, worried glance at David before following the assistant. That single glance, filled with so much fear and pleading, made David's insides twist with anguish. Inside the office, Dr. Bennett wasted no time with pleasantries. Her professional demeanor was replaced with an expression of deep concern. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "in 20 years of practice, I've rarely seen such a sophisticated and cruel case of psychological abuse." David felt the air leave his lungs. "Please tell me everything." "Rachel has developed a complex system of psychological torture," the psychologist continued, opening a folder with her notes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages. "She convinces Sophie that ordinary events in daily life are her fault. A glass broken accidentally becomes proof of Sophie's evil. A forgotten homework assignment is twisted into evidence that she doesn't deserve her father's love." David closed his eyes, feeling a wave of nausea. Each word from the psychologist was like a dagger to his heart. "But there's more," Dr. Bennett continued, her voice now almost a whisper. "Sophie drew this during our session." She slid a piece of paper across the table. The drawing depicted a small figure, clearly Sophie, alone in a dark space, surrounded by black and violet marks. In the corner of the paper, a red door stood out, and behind it, small crying faces were sketched in gray. "She told me about the basement," the psychologist explained. "About how Rachel locks her in there when you're not home. About the sounds she hears, the cries of other children she never sees, but who beg for help during the night." David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. But, that's impossible. We don't have. Exactly, Dr. Bennett interrupted, leaning forward. And that's what concerns me the most. Either Sophie is developing hallucinations due to severe trauma, or... The silence that followed was deafening. The implications were too horrifying to say out loud. That same afternoon, with trembling hands and a racing heart, David waited for Rachel to leave for the store. As soon as her car turned the corner, he descended into the basement, his footsteps echoing on the old wooden stairs. The red door, exactly like the one in Sophie's drawing, was there, hidden behind some old boxes. Rachel had always insisted that area was off-limits, that it was dangerous due to structural issues. Now, standing in front of the locked door, David realized how naive he had been. With trembling hands he inserted the master key. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the basement. When the door creaked open, the smell of mold and something else, something indescribable and disturbing, hit him like a wave. What he found inside made his stomach churn. The room was small, with walls covered in scratches and faded children's drawings. Some of them looked years old, perhaps even decades. In one corner, a small rusted iron bed still had a dusty blanket. Old, broken toys were scattered on the floor, like silent witnesses to past horrors. But it was the photos that made his blood run cold. Dozens of them, some already yellowed with age, others more recent. In each one, Rachel appeared different, shorter hair, longer hair, blonde, brunette, but always beside different families. Always with children. With trembling fingers, David flipped over one of the photos. On the back, a note, the Peterson family, 2018. Another photo, the Martinez family, 2015. And another, the Thompson family, 2012. In each image, the children smiled innocently, unaware they were posing with a monster. The newspaper clippings completed the grim story. The headlines seemed to shout from the yellowed pages. Tragedy strikes Peterson family. Father dies in mysterious accident, children missing. Search for Thompson siblings enters third month with no lead. Investigation into Martinez's disappearance remains inconclusive. The sound of tires on the driveway made David freeze. Rachel was coming back. With his heart in his throat, he quickly photographed everything with his phone, put the items back exactly as he had found them, and locked the door. His legs trembled as he climbed the stairs, his mind spinning with the horror of what he had uncovered. That night, after tucking Sophie into bed with silent promises of protection, David locked himself in his office. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he researched every case, every family, every tragedy Rachel had left in her wake. The pattern was eerily similar. She always targeted widowers or divorced men with young children. She always presented herself as the savior, the new chance at happiness. And always, inevitably, tragedy followed. His phone vibrated with a message from Ashley. "We need to talk. I found something about Rachel. It's not safe over the phone. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Central Cafe." What David didn't know was that every key he pressed, every message he sent, was being monitored. In the room next door, Rachel sat in the shadows, her face illuminated by the bluish light of her laptop as she read in real time the conversation between David and Ashley. Her eyes, usually cold and calculating, now gleamed with murderous fury. Beside her, an old box contained hurt souvenirs, photos, clippings, small trophies from every family she had destroyed. Her fingers caressed one particular photo. 3 smiling children who had disappeared 5 years ago. "Oh, David," she murmured to herself, a sinister smile forming on her lips. "You really shouldn't have gotten involved in this. Now I'll have to do it all over again, and this time I'll have to be even more careful." In her room, Sophie tossed and turned in uneasy sleep, her nightmares populated by shadows and crying voices from the basement. And David, in his frantic search for answers, couldn't imagine that his discoveries had just set in motion a deadly mechanism that threatened not only to expose Rachel's crimes but also to destroy everything he loved most. The true face of evil had been revealed, and now a race against time began. A race where the stakes were Sophie's life and David's very survival. The morning was exceptionally cold when David entered the Central Cafe, his eyes scanning the room for Ashley. The place was almost empty, except for a few early customers absorbed in their laptops. He found the teacher in a back corner, partially hidden by a large decorative plant. Ashley looked different. Her normally serene face was marked by deep circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she held an untouched cup of coffee. When she saw David, she quickly tucked her phone into her bag. "We need to be quick," Ashley whispered as soon as David sat down. "I don't know if I'm being paranoid, but I feel like I've been followed since last night." David felt a chill run down his spine. "What did you find?" Ashley pulled a brown envelope from her bag. "I spent the whole night researching after one of my former students, now a social worker, came to me. Rachel isn't who she says she is. Her real name is Rebecca Sanders, and she—" The sound of breaking dishes interrupted the conversation. A waitress had dropped a tray nearby. As everyone turned to look at the commotion, Ashley took the opportunity to slip the envelope to David. "Don't open it here," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are photos, police reports, documents. David, she's wanted in 3 different states. The children who disappeared?" Ashley stopped abruptly, her eyes widening as she looked over David's shoulder. Through the reflection in the window, he saw Rachel entering the cafe. His heart stopped for a moment. She was supposed to be at home, preparing lunch as she always did. "What a coincidence to find you two here." Rachel's voice was as sweet as poisoned honey. She approached the table, her smile not reaching her cold eyes. "David, darling, why didn't you tell me you were meeting with Sophie's teacher?" David felt the envelope weigh like lead on his lap. "It was a last-minute thing," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Ashley had some concerns about Sophie's performance." "Oh really?" Rachel tilted her head, her eyes fixed on Ashley like a predator assessing its prey. "How interesting. Sophie never mentioned any issues at school." "Actually," Ashley suddenly stood up, "I have to go. I have a class in 20 minutes. "So soon?" Rachel took a step toward Ashley, subtly blocking her path. "But you've barely started talking." The moment was interrupted by David's phone ringing. It was Sophie's school's number. "Mr. Williams?" The secretary's voice sounded concerned. "Sophie hasn't shown up to school today." "She's not sick, is she?" David's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "I saw her walk into school this morning." "I'm sorry, sir, but Sophie hasn't been seen in any classes today." David looked at Rachel, who maintained her serene smile. "Where is my daughter?" Rachel's smile only widened. "Oh, darling, you really think I didn't know what you were up to? That I didn't notice your little investigations?" She leaned over the table, her voice now a cold whisper. "Sophie is safe, for now. And she'll stay that way if you do exactly as I say." Ashley tried to reach for her phone, but Rachel was quicker. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, darling. Not when a child's life is at stake." "You're sick," David growled, his hands balling into fists. "No, David. I'm just practical." Rachel grabbed her bag, still wearing that serene smile. "Now you two are going to calmly walk with me to my car. No attention, please. And then we'll take a little trip to pick up Sophie." "And what if we refuse?" Ashley challenged, her voice shaking. Rachel sighed as if dealing with stubborn children. "Then the next time you see Sophie, it'll be on a missing poster, just like all the others." She paused, savoring the horror in their eyes. "Been through this before, you know? I'm very good at making children disappear." With his heart pounding in his chest, David and Ashley had no choice but to follow Rachel to the parking lot. The cafe was busier now, but no one noticed anything out of the ordinary, just 3 adults leaving together after what seemed like a normal meeting. In the car, Rachel drove calmly as if she were just out for a casual drive. "You know," she began, her voice eerily calm, "I really liked you, David. I thought we could have something special. But you had to start asking questions, didn't you? You had to start snooping where you shouldn't." "Why?" David asked, his voice hoarse. "Why do this?" Rachel laughed, a cold, joyless sound. "Why not? It's so easy, you know? Lonely men, desperate for another shot at love. Needy children longing for a new mother. And then?" She made a vague gesture with her hand. "Accidents happen." "You're a monster," Ashley whispered from the back seat. "No, darling. I'm an artist. Every family is a new blank canvas, every tragedy a unique masterpiece." Rachel took a sharp turn, entering a back road. "And now you're going to be part of my next work." The car stopped in front of an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The place looked like it hadn't seen visitors in years, with broken windows and a wild, overgrown garden. Rachel pulled a gun from her bag. "Get out of the car. No funny business." Inside the house, the smell of mold and neglect was suffocating. Rachel led them down to the basement, where the sound of muffled sobs could be heard. "Sophie?" David called, his heart nearly stopping as he saw his daughter tied to a chair, gagged and blindfolded. "Dad?" Sophie's muffled voice came through the gag. "What a touching scene," Rachel mocked, pointing the gun at Ashley. "Now, David, you have a choice to make. Who do you want to survive? Your daughter or the meddlesome teacher?" The sound of sirens in the distance made Rachel's smile falter for the first time. She quickly glanced at the small basement window. "Impossible," she murmured. "How?" That's when David noticed something glinting on Sophie's wrist. The GPS watch he had secretly placed on her the night before after discovering the photos in the basement. "I can be practical too," David said, his voice thick with controlled fury. The sirens were closer now, and the sound of cars stopping was clearly audible. Rachel frantically scanned the room, like a cornered animal, her mask of control finally breaking. "This isn't over," she hissed, retreating toward a door at the back of the basement. "It never ends." Before anyone could react, she disappeared through the door, the sound of her footsteps echoing in some hidden tunnel or passage. At that moment, police stormed into the basement, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. David ran to Sophie, his hands shaking as he untied her. As soon as she was free, she threw herself into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "She's coming back, Daddy," Sophie whispered through her tears. "She always comes back." Ashley, still trembling, approached with a blanket, gently wrapping it around Sophie. "Not this time, honey. Not this time." But as the police searched the property and paramedics arrived to examine Sophie, David couldn't shake Rachel's words from his mind. "It never ends." He knew she was out there, somewhere, probably already planning her next masterpiece. And as he held Sophie tightly in his arms, he silently vowed not to rest until Rachel was found and stopped from hurting another child. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cars reflected against the hospital walls, where Sophie was being examined. David never took his eyes off his daughter, as if he feared she might vanish if he blinked. In the hallway, detectives and officers moved with urgency, exchanging information about the search for Rachel, or Rebecca as they now knew her real name. Detective Lauren Martinez entered the hospital room, her serious demeanor carrying the weight of decades spent investigating child abuse cases. "Mr. Williams, we need to talk," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "We found something at the abandoned house that you need to see." David hesitated, glancing at Sophie, who had finally fallen asleep under the effect of light sedatives. Ashley, who remained at her side, nodded silently. "I'll stay with her." "Go." In the hallway, the detective opened a file containing photographs. "These were found in a secret room behind the passage where Rachel escaped," she explained. "Mr. Williams, what I'm about to show you is disturbing, but we need your help to understand it." The first photos showed what appeared to be an improvised office. On the walls, an elaborate board covered in photos, newspaper clippings, and detailed notes connected by red strings, like a macabre map of linked crimes. Rachel, or Rebecca, wasn't acting alone, the detective continued. "She's part of something bigger, a network that has been operating for decades." David felt his stomach churn as the next images came into view. They were photographs from different eras, some yellowed with age. In each one, different women posed with families, always the same pattern. Widowed or divorced fathers with small children. "This is an organization," Lauren explained. "They call themselves the Substitutes. Women who infiltrate vulnerable families, specifically targeting single parents with children. But their goal isn't just money or property. It's something more sinister." The detective stopped in front of a particular photo that made David freeze. It was an old, black and white image showing a young woman with eerily familiar features. "This is Margaret Sanders, taken in 1975, Lauren said. "Rebecca's mother, and the founder of the group." David felt the air leave his lungs. The woman in the photo had the same cold, calculating look as Rachel, the same smile that didn't reach her eyes. But why? Margaret believed she was purifying broken families, Lauren explained, her voice tinged with disgust. In her warped mind, children from divided homes needed to be liberated. She trained other women, including her own daughter, to continue her work. A sharp scream cut through the conversation. It came from Sophie's room. David rushed back, his heart almost stopping when he saw the scene. Ashley was lying on the floor, unconscious, and Sophie's bed was empty. The window, which should have been locked, was open, the curtains fluttering in the night breeze. "No, no, no!" David shouted, running to the window. Below, in the parking lot, he saw a figure carrying a child toward an ambulance. "Over there," he pointed to the officers who were already running in response to the cries. The chase that followed turned the hospital into chaos. The fake paramedic, who was later discovered to be another member of the Substitutes, had planned to use the ambulance for a quiet escape. What she hadn't expected was Sophie's reaction. "Aquí está tragicao para o inglés americano." The girl, who had only been pretending to be sedated, began to fight as soon as she was placed in the ambulance. Her screams and kicks bought enough time for David and the police to arrive. "Let my daughter go." David rushed toward the vehicle. The woman, cornered, pulled out a syringe. "Don't come any closer, or she'll take a one-way trip." It was at this moment that Sophie showed a courage no one expected. With a quick move, she bit her captor's arm with all her might. The syringe fell and chaos ensued. In the confusion that followed, something even more shocking happened. A second vehicle screeched into the parking lot. Behind the wheel was Rachel, but she wasn't alone. Sitting beside her, a woman in her old age smiled with a disturbingly familiar look. None other than Margaret Sanders herself. "Did you really think it would be so easy to stop us, David?" Rachel's voice rang out through the open window. "This is bigger than you can imagine. There will always be someone to continue our work." But before the vehicle could escape, several squad cars appeared, blocking all exits from the parking lot. The trap had been set. The police knew Rachel would return. "It's over, Rebecca," Detective Martinez advanced with her gun drawn. "Your mother may have started this, but you're going to finish it." Margaret Sanders laughed, a cold sound that sent chills down everyone's spine. "Full. You think it's just us? There are substitutes in every city, every state. We're a family." "No," a firm voice interrupted her. It was Sophie, now safe in David's arms. "Family is the ones who love and protect. You're monsters." The simplicity and strength of that truth spoken by a child seemed to strike Rachel in a way that no police threat ever could. For a moment, her face twitched, and David saw something he had never noticed before. Old burn marks, carefully hidden with makeup, running down her neck. "You were a victim too, weren't you?" David asked softly. "Your own mother?" "Shut up." Margaret spun around, furious, toward Rachel. "Don't you dare weaken now. Everything I did was to make you strong." In that moment, something broke inside Rachel. Years of conditioning and abuse came to the surface, and for the first time, everyone saw the true face of terror, not in Rachel's actions but in the woman who had turned her into a monster. "I was 7, Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "The same age as Sophie, when you killed my father and turned me into this." What happened next was so fast that later no one could describe it for sure. Margaret pulled out a gun, but before she could use it, Rachel rammed the car into one of the police blockades. The impact was violent. When the dust settled, Margaret Sanders was dead and Rachel was severely injured. As the paramedics, the real ones this time, carried her away, she looked one last time at Sophie and David. "I'm sorry," she murmured, blood trickling from her lips. "I never had a choice." The night ended with several arrests. The substitutes network began to crumble as more and more members were identified and captured. But for David and Sophie, the dawn came with a deeper, painful understanding. Sometimes the true monsters aren't the ones who commit the crimes, but the ones who turn people into criminals. In the hospital, as Sophie finally slept peacefully, David stared out the window, thinking about how evil can corrupt through generations and how love, the true love of a father for his daughter, might be the only force capable of breaking that cycle. 2 weeks had passed since the night at the hospital. Autumn painted the trees red and gold as David watched Sophie play in the yard of their new home, a temporary place provided by the Witness Protection Program. The girl still had nightmares, but slowly her smile was starting to return, like flowers blooming after a long winter. The phone rang, making David jump. It was Detective Martinez. "Mr. Williams, Rachel has awoken from the coma." Her voice sounded tense. "And she's asking to see Sophie." David felt his stomach churn. "Absolutely not. After everything she's done?" "There's something you need to know," Lauren interrupted. "We found new documents in Margaret's hideout." "David, Rachel isn't just another one of the substitutes. She is." The detective paused as if searching for the right words. "She's Sophie's biological mother." The world seemed to stop. David staggered to the nearest chair, his legs too weak to support him. "This is impossible." "Caroline, my wife?" "Caroline didn't die in a car accident, David. She was murdered by Margaret Sanders 7 years ago." "Rachel, no, Rebecca, was a young single mother who had Sophie taken from her by Margaret when the baby was just a few weeks old. Margaret forced Rachel to join her scheme, threatening to kill Sophie if she didn't obey." Memories flooded David's mind. The accident with Caroline had never been fully explained. The unrecognizable body. The rushed adoption of Sophie, which at the time he attributed to Caroline's kindness. Her desire to have children. "Margaret orchestrated everything," Lauren continued. "She eliminated Caroline, put Sophie with you through fake documents, and then used Rachel as one of her substitutes, knowing that her desire to reconnect with her daughter would keep her under control. That's why Rachel always focused on Sophie, David murmured, recalling the moments of apparent cruelty. She wasn't just being abusive, she was trying to toughen her up, prepare her to survive Margaret, Lauren completed. Rachel knew that her mother would never let Sophie live a normal life. Every act of cruelty was, in her twisted mind, a form of protection. In the hospital, Rachel was sitting in her bed, handcuffed and under constant surveillance. Her face, once always perfectly composed, now showed the scars she had long tried to hide, marks from a lifetime of abuse. David entered the room alone, leaving Sophie with Ashley in the waiting area. Rachel lifted her eyes, and for the first time he saw something genuine in her gaze: fear, regret, and a pain too deep to fake. "You know," she said simply. David nodded, unable to form words. "I was 19 when Sophie was born," Rachel began, her voice trembling. "It was the happiest and most terrible moment of my life. Happy because I finally had someone to love. Terrible because I knew my mother would never allow that." Tears ran down her face as she continued. "Margaret believed love was weakness. She took Sophie from me, saying it would make me strong. She forced me to watch while she killed people, destroyed families. Every time I tried to run away, she hurt another child. Why didn't you seek help? She had people everywhere. Cops, social workers, judges. No one would believe me. And then?" Rachel swallowed hard. "Then she killed Caroline and put Sophie with you. She said if I didn't follow her rules, she'd reveal the truth in a way that you'd never let me see Sophie again." David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every word. "The other disappearances, the other children? Some I managed to save," Rachel whispered, "sending them far away before Margaret found them. Others?" Her voice faltered. "I carry each one of them with me. Each face, each name." A movement at the door caught their attention. Sophie was there, having escaped Ashley's watch. Her large eyes observed the scene with a wisdom beyond her years. "Sophie, no." David tried to stop her, but the girl was already entering the room. Rachel recoiled, as if the presence of her daughter was too physical to bear. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to protect you properly." Sophie walked up to the bed, her small hand reaching for Rachel's. "You tried to warn me, didn't you?" The whispers in the basement. "It was you?" Rachel nodded, tears flowing freely now. "I stayed down there, trying to find the courage to get you out of that house. But every time I thought of running, Margaret showed up," Sophie finished. "I saw her sometimes, watching from my bedroom window." A sound in the hallway made them all turn. Detective Martinez rushed in, her face pale. "We need to get you out of here now," she said urgently. "We've just discovered Margaret had a twin sister, Eleanor Sanders, and she's alive." As if to confirm her words, the hospital lights flickered and went out. The emergency system kicked in, bathing everything in a ghostly red light. "She's here," Rachel whispered, pure terror in her voice. "Eleanor is worse than Margaret. She's the one who was really in charge of everything." The sound of gunshots echoed down the corridor. David grabbed Sophie, desperately searching for a place to hide her. Rachel, with a strength born of desperation, tore off the handcuffs that bound her to the bed, blood dripping from her wrist. "There's a maintenance passage behind that cabinet," she said quickly. "Take Sophie. I'll hold her off." "No." Sophie screamed, clutching Rachel's hand. "I won't leave you." The sound of footsteps grew louder. Rachel looked at David, a silent plea in her eyes. He understood. After years of making the wrong choices, she finally had the chance to make the right one. "Sophie," David said softly, "sometimes we have to let people go so they can protect us." More gunshots, closer now. Rachel kissed Sophie's forehead quickly. "I loved you from the moment I first saw you, my little one. And I will love you until my last breath." David carried Sophie to the secret passage, his heart breaking as he heard his daughter's sobs. Before the door closed, he saw Rachel positioning herself at the entrance of the room, ready to face her final demon. The sound of the confrontation that followed haunted them as they fled through the dark tunnels of the hospital. Sophie cried silently in David's arms, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The true face of love, he realized, sometimes reveals itself in the most painful sacrifices, in the hardest choices, and in the courage of a mother willing to die so her daughter could live. 6 months had passed since the night in the hospital. The snow softly covered the cemetery as Sophie placed a small bouquet of flowers on the simple grave. The tombstone had only one name, Rebecca Williams, and 2 dates that represented a life far too short, but whose end had been marked by an act of supreme love. David watched his daughter from a short distance, giving her the space she needed to say goodbye. Rachel's sacrifice, or Rebecca as she was now called, had saved not only Sophie but dozens of other children. Her final confrontation with Eleanor Sanders in the hospital had exposed the entire network of the substitutes. "She really loved me, didn't she, Dad?" Sophie asked softly, returning to David's side. "Yes, sweetheart," he replied, embracing her. In her own way, even though it was distorted by fear and abuse, she always tried to protect you. The investigations that followed revealed the true extent of the Sanders sisters' criminal organization. Eleanor had been captured that night, thanks to Rebecca's sacrifice, which kept her occupied long enough for the police to arrive. The final confrontation had been brutal. Rebecca, even wounded, fought with a ferocity born of decades of trauma and a desperate desire to protect her daughter one last time. Detective Lauren Martinez was now approaching them at the cemetery, carrying a thick folder. "Mr. Williams, Sophie," she greeted them gently. "I have some news you need to know." They sat on a nearby bench, the snow falling softly around them. Lauren opened the folder, revealing documents and old photographs. "We found Rebecca's diaries," she began. "She documented everything, every child she managed to save, every family she tried to protect. It wasn't just random acts of cruelty like we thought. She was collecting evidence, waiting for the right moment to expose it all." Sophie picked up one of the photos. It showed a much younger Rebecca, genuinely smiling while holding a baby. "Is that me?" she asked. Lauren nodded. "She kept every moment she could have with you before Margaret forced her to give you up. And then, well, she found a unique way to stay close to you." "Caroline," David murmured, remembering his late wife. "How does all of this connect to her?" "Caroline was a social worker who discovered part of the scheme," Lauren explained. "She was secretly investigating when she met you, David. But she also met Rebecca. In fact, they worked together for a while, trying to gather evidence against the Sanders sisters." David felt his heart tighten. So many secrets, so many layers of truth he had never suspected. "Caroline found out that Sophie was Rebecca's daughter," Lauren continued. "She planned to help Rebecca regain custody legally by exposing the entire scheme. But Margaret found out and killed her," Sophie finished, her voice small but firm. "Yes. But before that, Caroline had set everything up so that you, David, could legally adopt Sophie. She knew you would love and protect her, giving Rebecca a chance to stay close to her daughter, even if from afar." David closed his eyes, remembering how Caroline had insisted on the adoption, how everything had happened so quickly. "She died protecting us. Just like Rebecca," Lauren added softly. "Her last act was to make sure Eleanor could never hurt anyone again." Ashley, who had become a constant presence in their lives since the events at the hospital, approached with hot drinks for everyone. She had been instrumental in Sophie's healing process, offering not only emotional support but also a positive example of feminine strength. "We found this in Rebecca's belongings," Lauren said, handing an envelope to Sophie. "She wrote to you in case something happened to her." With hands trembling slightly, Sophie opened the envelope. The letter was stained in places, as though tears had fallen onto the paper as it was being written. "My dear Sophie, if you're reading this, it means I finally managed to do the right thing. I know my actions hurt you, and that it may be impossible to forgive me. But I want you to know that every moment of cruelty was a battle inside me, between the monster Margaret forced me to be and the mother I desperately wanted to be. You have been my light from the very first moment I held you. It was your love that gave me the strength to finally face the demons of my family. Caroline tried to save me, to save us, and I failed her. But through David, she gave us a precious gift, the chance for you to grow up loved and protected. David is your father in every way that matters. His love for you is pure and true, something I, in my broken existence, could never fully offer. But know that even in the darkest moments, even when my actions seemed cruel, every beat of my heart was for you. Be strong, my little one. Be brave. But above all, be happy. You deserve all the love in the world. With eternal love, your mother, Rebecca." Tears streamed down Sophie's face as she finished reading. David hugged her tightly, feeling his own heart break from the complexity of the love and pain they had lived through. "What happens now?" Sophie asked, her voice small but determined. "Now," David replied, "we honor the memory of two brave women who gave their lives to protect you. And we continue living, loving, and building something beautiful from all this pain." Lauren smiled gently. "And you're not alone. Eleanor is in prison along with dozens of other substitutes. The children we were able to find are being reunited with their families. The network has been completely dismantled. Rebecca succeeded," Sophie said softly, looking at her biological mother's grave. she finally managed to end it all. In the months that followed, life slowly found a new rhythm. David and Sophie moved into a new house, where Ashley became a frequent visitor. Their relationship blossomed naturally, born of mutual affection and respect, and the deep understanding that only those who have gone through fire together can have. Sophie kept Rebecca's letter in a special box, along with a photo of her as a baby. Sometimes she would read it again, finding new meanings in her biological mother's words. The pain never completely disappeared, but it transformed into something different. A deeper understanding of love in all its complex forms. On a spring afternoon, almost a year after the events at the hospital, Sophie was in the backyard of her new home, painting. Her drawings were filled with vibrant colors again, but occasionally she would still include a shadowed figure, not out of fear but as a silent guardian. "It's her, isn't it?" David asked softly, watching Sophie's latest drawing, where a dark figure protected a small girl from even darker shadows. Sophie nodded. "Sometimes I think she's still protecting us somehow." David hugged his daughter, watching the sunset. The true face of love, he had learned, is not always clear or simple. Sometimes it hides behind masks of pain, manifests in impossible choices, and shines brightest in the sacrifices we make for those we love. And so, in a small town that had witnessed so much terror and so much courage, a new family was growing, built on the foundations of true love, understanding, and forgiveness. Their story would forever be a testament to how, even in the darkest of times, the light of love can find a way. Wow. So, what did you think of this touching story? Did Rebecca's sacrifice for her daughter Sophie touch your heart? Were you impressed by David's courage to protect his family at all costs? Tell me in the comments which part moved you the most and what you thought of the intense conclusion of this story. And if you also believe that true love is about protection and sacrifice, share this story with someone special. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. That helps us keep bringing deep and emotional stories like this to you. Also, hit the bell so you don't miss any new stories. We'll see you in the next story, which promises to be just as intense and emotional as this one. Until then.